Sure. Okay. Let's talk discreetly, structurally. How is it different from the old SAT?
The biggest difference is in our paper SAT, we used to see these long 70, 80 line passages that would be followed by 10 questions. So I would read one chunk of passage and then I would be asked 10 different types of questions on that passage. The digital SAT, the biggest difference is that you get one small passage. It's going to be anywhere between 10, 15, max 20 lines, and you're going to be asked one single question based on that passage. So the biggest difference is length, and because of that, it has become more important to kind of check in with time on the digital SAT.
So how long is overall compared to the previous?
So the digital SAT, it's made up of two sections. So there's a reading writing section and a math section. Each section has two modules. The reading writing modules are 27 questions, 32 minutes each. The math sections are 22 questions, 35 minutes each. So taking the break time, doing all four modules, the exam is around 2.5 hours, which is quite a bit shorter than the paper SAT. So it's a lot shorter, it's a lot faster, it's more condensed. Those are kind of the biggest differences, I would say, with the paper SAT.
And it's all online. It's digital now.
It is.
I assume there is a certain sort of mindset shift, a certain way of taking tests different, or is it very much similar to the paper where it's just, okay, but now we're just clicking the mouse instead of being able to, I guess, annotate on the paper or having to fill in bubbles?
Well, I think the question, I feel like by the time we talk to students who are getting ready for digital SATs, there's no need for comparisons from the paper to digital nowadays because this is all they have to work with. Mm-hmm. The current seniors who took paper, half digital, those are the ones who can see the differences. But as far as what the current freshmen, sophomore, and juniors are dealing with on the prepping for the PSATs and digital SATs, they are taking the digital test that they're more trained to do so.
Sure, that's the only one they get.
More trained to do so, and they're so comfortable taking these sort of examinations on computer, timed exams, and one thing I want to mention about the change of format from paper to digital is that even though students are enjoying the benefit of having a shorter test, we lost the whole transparency on how these tests are scored now. No one really knows how many you can miss to score what. I mean, it wasn't so clear in the paper version as well, but at least there was a raw scale that we could see that you can convert, you can sort of anticipate, right? But now that they don't do, as far as I know, we don't have any question answer services that are released to make you can't really request any sort of test your questions back from what you took, like we did in the old days, right? So shorter test, but scoring, I think there's going to be a challenge just getting over the challenges that most kids have getting over 1500s as there's I think there might have been a more even distribution from 13, 14, 1500, right? But nowadays it feels like there are going to be a lot of kids kind of stuck below 1400 and there are a lot of kids just going way above 1550s now. That's
Well, you talked about modules.
Mm-hmm.
There are 4 modules, I believe, total.
Mm-hmm.
2 for reading, writing, 2 for math.
Mm-hmm.
And there's an upper-lower module aspect to this whole thing.
Right, and that kind of piggybacks a little bit off of what Ted just said about transparency issues. So what the digital SAT has is that it's a module adaptive exam, meaning based on your performance on the first module of either the reading and writing section or the math section, you will be given what is considered a lower module. So if you perform rather poorly or comparatively poorly on the first module, you'll get a lower module. And if you do better on the first module, you'll get the upper module for the second module.
So when we talk about the new SAT being adaptive, it's not adaptive question by question.
No.
It's adaptive module by module, but
right.
only in comparison to the first two modules of each section.
Right.
Okay.
So you still have the liberty of being able to jump through questions, kind of explore the section. There's no penalty for kind of moving around or guessing or moving, going in a different order. It's entirely module adaptive. So whatever you do, and just to kind of talk about the lack of transparency that Ted talked about a little bit, is that we don't actually know what the cutoff for the upper and lower modules are.
There's no information on
that
that.
information hasn't been released, and we also don't really know score cutoffs based on upper and lower modules. So it's kind of hard to say, just looking at your reading writing score, whether you got the second upper module or you got the lower module. Maybe you got the lower module but did really well the second module. It's really hard for us to tell right now. The only thing that seems to be one way to kind of guess that we got the second upper module is if you notice that in your second reading writing module, you're seeing what I consider slightly more upper echelon level reading questions. So that's going to be a lot of the inference questions, maybe a lot of function questions, and then less main idea detail questions. So and the structure and purpose questions. So if you see that kind of distribution and you're getting the general feeling that like, oh, this module is quite tough, you probably did very well on the first module, and luckily you made it. You made the threshold to the second one.
And you can get that experience by taking the Blue Book through the SAT app, but you can't do it via their linear tests or PDFs that are online?
Right. So the linear tests just have all 33 questions, which would be that could potentially be in a module. You would have to take the practice test using the app to know if you got, to test the adaptive testing. Only thing is the Blue Book app does not tell you if you got the upper or lower module. So you would not be able to know. But you do get the experience of the adaptive testing.
We did
You're
test
right.
it though. Deanna knows what the upper module and the lower module looks like because we tried many different times, right?
Right.
So she mentioned how there's less main idea detail questions. There's more of inference and command of evidence questions, right? Function questions. So Deanna and I, we tell students that if you are seeing these like based on like you can sort of guess what numbers are what questions. So if you get function questions around like what's a good number? Function questions right around number 8 or 9, and then you see more inference questions toward I would say 15, 16, 17. That means you have gotten the upper module. Whereas if you're seeing vocab, words and context questions from 1 through 6, 7, I would say this is more likely a lower module. So there is a way to anticipate that.
Yeah, it's not a hard or fast rule, but if you see a lot of vocab questions, it's likely that you are in the lower module.
Yes.
The other kind of sure way is the difficulty of the answer choices of vocab questions. I have seen modules where there are 4 basic vocab questions with quite difficult answer choices. That's a really good giveaway. Usually the giveaway is that if you start seeing main idea questions in the second module, you shouldn't really be seeing those there.
Oh, it shouldn't be there at all? Main ideas?
You really shouldn't be seeing those.
I did realize, so while I'm teaching, main idea questions and detailed questions are significantly easier than the questions about functions and command of evidence and inferences. So finding 2, 3 main idea / detail questions on module 2 would mean that you are on the lower module. Yeah.
Okay, so no real surefire way, but you can
Not
get a
really.
general gist based on the difficulty of the questions. Although both the upper and the lower module will have easy, medium, hard questions, just I assume the distribution is a little bit skewed.
Right.
Okay. Well, if I'm going to start to prep for this SAT, we only have the 6 Blue Book tests and the app. Not really much else. I guess Khan Academy has a little bit of resources there. Will the old SATs help at all?
For the math, I think that they could be helpful. Nothing has changed in terms of the breadth of knowledge that is being tested in the math section, meaning you're being asked the same general information and math concepts. So if you really just need a lot of drills, a lot of practice with the math section, that would be a great place to do that. Writing might be a good place to just check in, make sure you know the rules, you're understanding all the grammar rules. But I don't think that reading will be very helpful because it's just an entirely different situation.
A completely new test in terms
Right.
of studying, understanding, application of skills. So as much as possible, maybe don't base your studying on the old tests.
No.
Just the math, and like Diana said, writing rules. You can still use the Khan Academy writing tutorials as they haven't changed as much. There's just more punctuation questions, more, this new type of questions they call new scope called boundaries, and they involve punctuations and transitions and so on. Well, transitions within. I'm not talking about the transition questions that come out. What was that called? Transition questions on the writing is part of a different category, but the boundaries questions in the writing is heavy with punctuation rules. Those can be checked with ACT English as well as SAT writing from the previous.
The questions that start with as the conventions of English.
all of
Right,
those,
right.
Right.
all of those. It's either form, structure, and sense, or the boundaries, either one. And then there's a transition questions at the end. So really 3 different types. But form, structure, and sense can be learned from paper. Boundaries questions can be learned from paper, but as well as ACT English, where there's a lot of punctuation questions. I had 4 SAT reading sessions in 2 weeks. I had 4 classes so far. It is so different from what I expected, and I had to prep so much. Unlike past 10 years of teaching SAT writing, I never have to prep once because it's everything I knew. Reading, I used to prep for the paper versions, and I could remind myself what I'm reading and making marks, and I could leave traces of what I'm reading and doing all that. This one, although it's a linear version, paper version, right? But it requires different set of skills to teach the command of evidence, the inference, and the research questions. I think they're called the synthesis questions, right?
Rhetorical synthesis.
Rhetorical synthesis. Those questions are not SAT reading anymore. It's teaching ACT science, ACT. No, it's like ACT science. It's so much like ACT science. And kids are learning more. They're getting better by reading less and less. So it's kind of, I would say, it's not encouraging good amount of reading to go to college, but it's really just learning where to pick out information. I don't know if that's the right thing to do prepping for college, right?
Well, it's a shorter test as well overall.
Yeah, so it feels very different. How effective is our class right now? I think it's more tractable. At least the amount of work that we give out to students and what we can gauge in terms of their output, it's much more tractable. We can manage it better. But the scariest part about this is that to improve SAT reading, to improve their reading ability, their reading scores, it's harder than doing it on the paper, I think, because it's whether you get it or not kind of thing for a lot of questions. The inference, the command of evidence, the rhetorical synthesis questions, it's a matter of whether you get it or not. And kids who are slow at it, it's hard to pick it up. And that's the same that goes with ACT science.
Is that it usually a vocabulary word, or is it a skill set?
Well, vocab is always been vocab, right?
Sure.
But it's a skill set issue on top of vocab now. So they have to do with 2 things at the same time, and we can build vocab over time, say 3 to 6 months if they train intensively. But the skill set, there's like 4 components to it. There's a graph you got to be able to comprehend. You have to be able to connect that graph to the title of the passage. You got to read question, and then there's the answer choices, right? So to put everything in one question, one piece, and be able to solve that. The kids who solve these questions can solve under 40 seconds, average. 40 seconds, right? The tougher ones, right? The kids who can't, they can't solve it, period. You give them 5 minutes, they're still wandering around.
There's no elimination. They just are going in circles and circles, reading it over and over again.
Because if you can't extricate there's a step in between question to identifying what you're supposed to find, you get stuck, and then the more you start reading, it gets worse. The
Yeah,
point is you gotta read less.
you talked about this.
I partially agree
Yeah.
with what Ted is saying, and I absolutely agree with everything he's analyzed about the reading section. It's totally true that the first most important thing about this reading section is that the more you read, the more confusing it will be. It is not
Yes.
friendly for reading comprehension-based students. So really, when I teach class, what I always say is the person who wrote this passage did not write it to intend to be kind to you. The point of the passage is not to convey information. The point of this passage is to ask a question. So really what's more important, like Ted said, the new reading comprehension is really a skill-based exam. And what that means is you have to understand, depending on the different question types, what the question is asking you to look for. It's a very different set of information or sentences that you have to look for if you're solving a main idea question versus a function question. It's in class I call it the scope, which is each question requires me to look at a different part of the passage. And the students who are solving it in 40 seconds or less, and you can, is because they have great understanding of what each question type is actually asking me to do. So I half agree with Ted that it's difficult to pick up, but I think it's because it's so formulaic now, students who are willing to pick it up, I think you could. You have to put in the effort to learn it. But I think it's the opposite, where I felt that a lot of paper SAT, especially with the history sections, if you didn't read growing up, and especially if you didn't read classics, you didn't read nonfiction, you didn't read history texts, you could not in 4 months pick up enough skill to get through that passage. You just kind of had to say, I'm not getting the history passages, and learn to do the other ones. So compared to that, I think even if you haven't been reading a whole lot in high school or before, even if you don't spend a lot of personal time reading on your own, I think because it's so skill set heavy, you could definitely learn the ropes of navigating through a reading passage and be successful at the end of the day. But Ted is entirely correct, is that it's a very specific skill set. You have to be hitting those marks.
I think some students might get a feeling that because it's a new test and there's not a lot of transparency and we're still learning about it and still changing to an extent, they might feel like they're guinea pigs, or that they don't feel it's completely fair. What would you say to these students?
I definitely understand that feeling, and it's not entirely unsubstantiated just by looking at the linear versions of the exams. What we currently have, the first 4 linear tests were put out together, and then we, after a couple of months, got test 5 and 6. Now, if you look at test 6 and compare it to any of the first 4, there's a lot of difference in, especially the reading section, in how the question stems are written. So what I mean by question stem is that part of the question that actually asks the question, like which of the following logically completes, or what is the main idea of the text. If you look at test 6 of College Board's test 6, you'll notice that there's a great more variety in test 6 than there are in test 1 through 4, which means that College Board is constantly updating, changing, manipulating this exam, and they will continue to in these early years. So you're not wrong to feel kind of like you've been handed the short end of the stick by having to do the SAT here. Sorry. But so there's 2 ways to look at that. One, you might want to ask yourself if you want to take the ACT. That exam is a little more kind of well built and predictable at this point.
Predictable.
And the other question I would ask is, why really the changes and the updates on the digital SAT isn't so big that if you understand, going back to what we talked about earlier, the core skill set for each question, if you understand the navigation tools for looking through the reading section, these small changes as they come up shouldn't be influencing your score that much. So if you are at a point where you feel like the exam isn't predictable and you don't know what's going to come out and it looks different, in the test center versus on the blue book exam, it's so different that I can't focus. I would more ask you to go back and say, do you have the foundational skills down? Because I think the less that's true, the more turbulent that difference is going to feel.
Okay.
I think one way to justify the foundations but on the PSAT test or the SATs, just based on my past experiences, if you can score over 650 on either sections, then you do have your foundation set. Whereas if you're scoring below 600 and trying to take the test as soon as possible or set a date that you want to take, let's say like this summer, right? And you have 600, give or take, 10, 20 points, right? And you're looking to take the test in August because you feel like that's a good date. That's just not a smart move, is what I think.
Yeah, I want to talk about the August test a little bit. I think there's this idea that because August is kind of at the end of summer, you had this breadth of time to study. A lot of kids may be really kind of committed to doing the SAT over the summer. You feel like you have to take the August exam because it seems like a natural procession of things, right? You studied over the summer, you take the exam right before fall semester starts or right at the beginning of fall semester because that seems to make the most sense. And it does, but if you're not ready to take the August exam, don't go into the August exam. Right? You don't take an exam because it's there or you can sign up for it. You take the exam when you're ready. And there are a couple parameters for knowing if you're ready to sit the official exam, like Ted just talked about. It's going to be what scores are you getting on your diagnostics? How are the splits coming up, reading, writing versus math? How much more time do you have to work on the SAT? There are a lot of other factors to think about. So just because there is an August exam and just because you can take it doesn't mean you should. You should think about it before you take it or sign up for it.
Okay.
That's just because we teach SATs and most of our students have high expectations on what they want to achieve on the SATs, right? So with the type of foundations that we're talking about, we are dealing with mostly students who want to break 1550s and try to get 1600 if possible. And of course, there are students who are scoring thousands and 1100s. And if you want to overcome your first hurdle, maybe break 1350, 1400, I think that could be a plan for students of where their starting scores are in the thousands, right?